So let me begin by mapping out the territory of today's lecture. I teach a class at Cornell University called What is Science? Now, I started teaching this class in 1996. We got an NEH leadership grant, and one of the things was to develop a new curriculum in science studies. And we started this class with about 10 students. I've been teaching this class ever since, and today we have to cap the class at 120 students. So it's a kind of big deal class now. We have 4 TAs. It's a class taken by equal mixes of scientists, engineers, and humanists. So you might ask, why should scientists and engineers take a class called What is Science? After all, they're doing science, or at least science courses, so you'd think they'd know what science is. But what I find is that students doing science are too busy doing problem sets or spending time in labs running experiments to actually find the time to reflect on the wider nature of science as an endeavour. And that's what my class is about, and what I want to try and do tonight, to ask, what is science? Now, why is it important for all of us, non-scientists as well, to reflect on the nature of science? Now, let's try to make a statement here, because science seems to me arguably the best form of knowledge generation that we as humans on this planet have achieved so far. I want to make that clear. Science is awesome. I like to use that American word. My daughters are always using it. Science is awesome. It's something that not only produces new knowledge, e.g. Einstein's view that matter cannot travel faster than the speed of light, but also overthrows old knowledge, the Newtonian worldview, where mass and energy were distinct. Now, there's something truly dynamic and amazing about a body of beliefs and practices that can allow itself to overthrow what has gone before. For instance, these experiments you've probably read about very recently from CERN, currently claiming that neutrinos do indeed travel faster than the speed of light. These experiments may not turn out to be accepted, and we can discuss this in Q&A. I'm betting they won't be, that they'll find some experimental error. But it's amazing that they have the potential to overthrow what has gone before. I think if you contrast this with other forms of belief and practices we have, say religion, science is amazing. Science also produces not only knowledge for knowledge's sake, but stuff that makes a difference. I'm just making some obvious points here. E.g., that we are made up of this weird double-stranded molecule consisting of 2 polynucleotide chains in the structure of a double helix called DNA. By the way, you might notice I was a little bit stumbling there. I find this DNA stuff hard. As you heard, my own background is in physics. When my daughter was at high school and asked me for help with her homework, I could really help with the chemistry. I could just about manage that, because the name of the elements have stayed the same. The identity of chemists seemed pretty much the same. You know, they like making smelly stuffs, and they have explosions in the labs and things like that. It hasn't changed that much. And the math was pretty much the same. The physics was pretty much the same. But when she used to show me her biology homework, I was completely at a loss. All this stuff about genetics, they had to learn DNA, RNA, chromosomes. That's only the beginning. So I'm pretty clueless about that biology stuff. Indeed, I have to confess, I texted my daughter yesterday, who's doing a degree in molecular biology, for the correct definition of DNA. I thought it was made up of proteins, and she corrected me and told me, Dad, it only encodes proteins. Well, I hope she's right, because I don't know. Anyway, DNA is at the root of understanding most biology today, but this same DNA can have massive consequences. It can not only send you to prison, if you happen to carelessly leave some of it around where you commit what you think is the perfect murder, but it can also free you from prison if you spent years there for something you didn't do, and you're lucky enough for someone else to carelessly have left their DNA around, and you're even more lucky if this has been well enough preserved to prove you didn't do it. So this is just obvious. There are massive consequences for science, for the rest of society. New drugs stemming from science are even more amazing. That same daughter who tells me what DNA is has had scarlet fever twice. It's no big deal. A century ago, scarlet fever was like a death sentence. Today, it's a sentence in a public lecture. By the way, you'll notice I've already run together science with medicine, And arguably, we should be disentangling science from medicine and indeed technology. And in these Golem books I've been writing with Harry Collins, we have a Golem of science, we have a Golem of technology, we have a Golem of medicine. We try and disentangle it. But today I'm kind of running them together. Maybe in the Q&A we can start to separate them more. So what I'm trying to do is think of science with, as it were, a capital S, standing for all that good stuff which stemmed from the Enlightenment. For now, just think of science as something involving systematic inquiry into the stuff of the world and making new discoveries about that stuff, whether that stuff be dark matter, the brain of mollusks, or social networks. Now, I want to warn you that the answer I'll give tonight to the question, what is science, will infuriate some of you. I will argue that one of the most important and neglected aspects of science to understand are its roots in society. In short, the world of humans. So why am I going to risk infuriating some of you? To understand that, you'll need to know a little bit about where I'm coming from. In short, what I do. I'm a sociologist of science and technology. So let me repeat that. I do the sociology of science. Now think a little bit about that. A sociologist of science sounds almost like an oxymoron. Worse, we all know there's a hierarchy in the sciences. My first degree is in physics. Physics used to be called the queen of the sciences. Now probably today molecular biology is the queen. Certainly the biggest, tallest buildings on our campus are molecular biology buildings, not physics buildings anymore. Physics may not be the queen, but it's certainly up there with the high-end royalty, perhaps the Duchess of the Sciences, or maybe the Baroness of the Sciences, I don't know. It doesn't quite have the same ring as the queen, but something like that. Now, in this hierarchy of the sciences, which I'm certain you'll recognize, what is pretty low down the totem pole? You've got it, sociology. Now, I'll tell you a story. When I finished my degree, this is a true story, in physics at Imperial College London, that's kind of like a sort of techie place, sort of MIT of England, I moved to the University of Bath to do my PhD in humble sociology. My old professor of physics, Professor Paul Matthews, had meanwhile become the Vice-Chancellor of Bath University. It's rather like the rector of the university over here, sorry, the president over here. Well, he knew I was at Bath University and asked to have lunch with me. And I remember his first question to me was, Trevor, how could you do it? Leave physics for sociology. And having been trained as an undergraduate physicist, I knew exactly what he meant. As far as physics was concerned, we thought we did the real thing, the technical hard stuff, about the underpinning of matter and so on, solving Schrödinger's equation, for instance. Sociology, that was soft stuff, we thought, for people who couldn't quite crank out the problem sets, and so on. I keep telling my daughter this as well. She's doing sciences. Stay with the sciences. Leave the sociology for others. Now, notice several things in what I've said already. I've talked about hierarchy and the feeling of superiority it leads to. I've expressed that hierarchy in loaded language. Some would say the gendered loaded language of hard versus soft. These are interesting sociological observations. But the content of the so-called hard scientist prejudice against sociology is to deny the very sociological basis in which these sorts of comments are cast. It says, in effect, hierarchy isn't anything to do with it, even though obviously it does have something to do with it. In short, there's something very weird going on about being a sociologist of science. It goes to a very deep problem in how scientists think about themselves and how science is framed. In a nutshell, within science, the standard view is that the truth speaks for itself, that the laws of nature are revealed by careful experiment. If the scientist has a role to play, it's in letting nature speak through them. While truth is always about nature, error is always about humans. When scientists make mistakes and things go wrong or go down alleys we think of today as blind, these failings are often expressed as human failings. When two chemists, Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann, famously claimed, I don't know if anyone remembers this controversy, back in 1989, they discovered fusion in a test tube, so-called cold fusion. Does anyone remember that stuff? Yes, good. Their claims were met with incredulity, especially physicists. It seemed theoretically unlikely, and in any case, Pons and Fleischmann were seeing nuclear particles called neutrons at the level, if they were seeing at the level they claimed in their experiments, and these would be being produced by fusion, they should have been fried alive by the expected amount of radiation produced. And apparently they weren't. Eventually, when other scientists repeated the experiments, the consensus emerged that cold fusion was not a breakthrough technology, By the way, even to this day, one of the interesting things about looking at these sorts of events, there's an underground of cold fusion researchers who still report positive results. Pons and Fleischmann's errors had to be explained away. Scientists talked about Pons and Fleischmann being motivated by greed, by patent rights, of doing bogus science, junk science, schlock science in pursuit of a Nobel dream. In short, human failing and social issues and motivation are evoked to explain error. This social process of debunking someone's credibility can be very subtle. Maybe it's not so subtle in this, what I'm going to tell you next, but I found it subtle. The early laboratories that found cold fusion were at the University of Utah. These are ones that had positive results. Texas A&M and Georgia Tech. The negative results came in from Caltech and MIT. The elite physicists at MIT and Caltech joked that only universities with big football teams could find cold fusion. I don't know if you've heard that joke before. Now, I always had to have this joke explained to me coming from the UK, but it seems that it works by a form of sneering at non-elite universities with their football teams. Humour and its use to sneer at other people are social processes that reveal again the subtle or not too subtle face of the human in science. Now, this fundamental asymmetry in accounting of truth and error in science, as pointed out by two sociologists of science, Michael Mulcahy and Nigel Gilbert, in a marvellous book called Opening Pandora's Box, explains why the sociology of science seems an almost impossible subject from the perspective of scientists, unless you're just talking about the sociology of error. That's okay, talking about how social bias such as race and gender led scientists to distort their results, such as in pseudosciences, such as craniology, where in the 19th century they compared the ability of races by the sizes of their craniums, and lo and behold, who had the biggest craniums? You've got it, white male scientists. So when you talk about the social underpinnings leading to error, that's okay, that's fairly easy to do. But talking about the social underpinnings of what we take to be our best knowledge, true knowledge, as I want to do today, is much harder to do. The problem goes deeply into the language of science. Think of how laboratory notebooks are written and laboratory experiments are written up in scientific papers. School kids are trained to write their notes up in particular ways and to report in papers in particular ways. As Sir Peter Medawar remarked years ago in a famous piece called "Is the Scientific Paper a Fraud?", the account presented in the literature is highly stylized and often does not represent what was actually done. Here's a little example, trivial thing. Look at these two accounts of scientific activities. One, Gina entered her laboratory late at night and peered bleary-eyed at the gel. Second, the gel was observed. The latter account, written in the passive tense with no mention of Gina and her bleary eyes, is of course the standard scientific account. All reference to the person on the particular occasion have been effaced. This is the way a scientist would write it up today. Maybe not in the time of Darwin, by the way. But the first account might be more accurate as to what actually happened that night. By putting the human, Gina, with her bleary eyes back into the account, we make it somehow seem less robust, less credible. So science seems to work in part by effacing its human traces. In a way, nature speaking to scientists is treated as sacred, but the humans who enable nature to speak are treated as profane. You want a religious metaphor for getting at this. Now, language is so important that I always start my introductory class, my introductory lecture series at Cornell in this What is Science class, by talking about language in science. We talk about language in general, including analysis of the word dude, but then we move on to more technical stuff about how scientific papers are written and the importance of metaphors in science. So we're just going to start with this simple stuff from this. A metaphor is a figure of speech. There's a definition from Chambers' Dictionary, and I'm certain you all know this. A figure of speech which I think is spoken of as being that which is only resembled, as when a ferocious man is called a tiger. Here's some examples of some metaphors. They're all religion's full of them. The Lord is my shepherd. The Lord isn't actually a shepherd, but it's a metaphor. The light that shines comes from thine eye, comes from thine eyes. I can't really do this that well. Romeo to Juliet isn't actually light shining from their eyes, it's a metaphor. And this one, I'm taking this it to be metaphorical. Oops, I did it again, from Britney Spears. So we find pop songs are full of metaphors. And I'm sorry, this is out of date. I sometimes get to Green Day, but I should have something more contemporary. It's obvious that without language, and metaphors, science as an institution would not work. So just think of metaphors in science. Metaphors like greenhouse gases, okay, it's a metaphor. Gene guns, or shotgun sequencing. By the way, I last gave this talk in Texas, so it's stacked full of gun metaphors. But these metaphors are not just unfortunate embellishments, which somehow could be eliminated. I think that this is always the argument we have about these when we get into a dispute. No, we don't really need the metaphors. I think you do. I think scientists really works with the metaphors. They're the very basic sorts of tools scientists use to think and to come up with new experimental procedures. There's a philosopher of science, Max Black, who was at Cornell, who's got a marvelous book on models and metaphors in science. If you're interested in this topic, it hasn't been bettered since. But it talks about how these metaphors and models work in science. Metaphors in science are not only important, but so are metaphors for describing the activity of scientists. Now, we're actually rather impoverished in terms of our metaphors of science and how we get, this is where we get to the Golem part of my talk. So scientists use metaphors. People who study science, we haven't got quite so many metaphors. People often think of scientists as god-like figures, bringing down the sacred tablets from the mountains. The sorts of things science and technology and medicine have delivered to us, such as the cure for scarlet fever, often appears miraculous. That we can take a pair of binoculars and I can show you craters and mountains on the moon, something at the time of Galileo which rocked religion to its foundations to believe the moon was a perfect heavenly sphere, stuff like that. I can watch the soccer game of my local team in England on the internet anywhere there is connectivity, and provided that the game is available, and it can ruin my weekend faster than ever since my team, Norwich City, invariably loses. But this is kind of miraculous stuff. These things are incredible and only possible with science. Think of the peak of high modernity, say in the late 1950s, when scientists were the kings and kingmakers, to use another metaphor. Think of how the Allies' victory in the Second World War was dependent crucially upon science, from radar through to atom bomb, and how the vast expansion of higher education post-Second World War was largely because of the success of science in the war, and so on. So in this view, scientists are godlike, or as knights in crusading armor, to use a religious metaphor. It's a way that many people used to think about science and scientists, and some still do today. But then think of the downside of science, ways of thinking about science. The risk of totally destroying our planet by nuclear war, environmental degradation, and so on. And then there's a readily available another metaphor of science, which comes across from Mary Shelley's fictional character, Frankenstein. Actually, in the original book, it's the scientist who's Victor Frankenstein, not the monster himself. This Frankenstein metaphor is all-pervasive when one wants to portray science and scientists as evil, with technology out of control and messing with the sanctity of human life and what it is to be human. Now when protesters, particularly in Europe, protest something like genetically modified foods, they often call these foods, I think I have a slide of this, Frankenfoods, a rather distorted image of Frankenstein. So this is a very common metaphor. So when this word golem comes from this series of books that my co-author and mentor Harry Collins and I have been writing. We try and use this as a new metaphor to get away from these two hackneyed images of good and evil. And I just read you, forgive me if I just read a tiny bit from our introduction here of why we use it. I couldn't find words better than this. I'm just going to read it from the book, The Golem of Science. Science seems to be either all good or all bad. For some, science is crusading night beset by simple-minded mystics, while more sinister figures wait to find a new fascism on the victory of ignorance. For others, it's the science which is the enemy. Our gentle planet, our feel for the just, the poetic and the beautiful, are assailed by a technological bureaucracy, the antithesis of culture, controlled by capitalists with no concern but profit. For some, science gives us agricultural self-sufficiency, cures for the crippled, and a global network of communication. For others, it gives us weapons of war, a school teacher's fiery death at the space shuttle falls from grace, and the silent, deceiving, bone-poisoning Chernobyl. So what we're trying to offer with this golem metaphor is to take a middle way. The golem comes in Jewish mythology. It's a humanoid made by man, by a rabbi, from clay and water with incantation and spells. It's powerful. It grows a little more powerful every day. It will follow orders, do your work, and protect you from the ever-threatening enemy. but it's clumsy and dangerous, without control. A golem may destroy its masters with its flailing vigor. So we like to think of this golem. We want to get nature, and they're made of clay. It's made by humans. It's kind of our metaphor for science and scientists. And I have some images, I think, of golems here. That's from the original silent movie, The Golem. This is from, I think it's the Serbo-Croat. This may be the wrong way round. Translation of our book, The Golem. That's a beautiful Italian cover. There's different renditions of these monsters of Golem. Pokemon Golem, and of course, not to be confused with Gollum in Lord of the Rings. Okay. Now, and it's an interesting issue to debate. Maybe in the question now we can think of, what is this a good metaphor for science? Can we think of other metaphors? So think about the activity of science and scientists. We offer this Golem metaphor. Now, so far I've been talking about language, metaphors and the like. Now, you may be prepared to grant that science uses language laden with metaphors, but this misses the core of science. What about observation? Surely there's nothing social about that. All scientists do is just carefully observe what's out there in the world, and their observations are the cornerstones for our cumulative knowledge of the natural world. So we need to examine observation a bit more carefully. And this is when I will switch to the overhead projector to show you an image, which I hope I have here, which I use in class. And, well, I hope this image is here. Oh, it is, thank goodness. So let me press Doc Cam. And if you've seen this image before, please don't say anything. But I want you to participate. I want to ask you what you see with this image. You can see it okay, right? So anyone would venture what you can see? Well, you probably, if I can just put some words in, you probably see some black and white kind of splodgy stuff, right? You see anything else? Batman? Paddy Hearst?
Jesus.
Ah, who said Jesus? Yeah. People can see a face of Jesus. Would you mind describing where that face is?
It's centered.
Yeah.
From 60% up to the top of the picture.
Yeah, so it's in this area here.
That's the beard.
Think of Jesus or Che Guevara. Now, do you think I'm making this up? Who can see this face? Or can you all see? A lot of you can see it. Good, good, excellent. Or maybe it's too easy to see it. Sometimes in certain light it's easier to see it than in others. It works better if you don't see it. Because if you put it upside down, like this, it's harder to see the face upside down. Just something about faces. I use images like this, and it varies a lot. Sometimes it depends particularly on the observational circumstances that you show the slide. Sometimes people can see it immediately. Is there anybody who can't see this face? There's a few of you. It's better not to be able to see it. I couldn't see it for a long time. Because when you suddenly see it, you can ask that question, what has changed? Why can I see it now when I couldn't see it before? Because the photons that are coming into your eyes and hitting the retina of your eyes probably are much the same. But you have the ability to organize your visual field into seeing a face. Okay. Another way of getting at this is through, let me just put one of these up. This duck rabbit. This one is better because once you see it as a face, unless you turn it upside down, it's harder to see, which is a bit like science. It's more cumulative. This one is from Wittgenstein. This is a Gestalt switch image of the duck rabbit. Okay, you can see two things in this. You can switch between seeing as a duck, seeing it as a rabbit. So it's like a rabbit going facing that way with its ears sticking out, or a duck this way. This is the duck-rabbit thing. But your visual, the photons that are arriving haven't changed. It's your ability to visually organize the field that's changed. Okay. So one can start to think about this. There's a concept in the philosophy of science, and I stand corrected, we have some proper philosophers of science in the room, called the theory lateness of observation. And you can think of this as a kind of a low-level theory, a theory of a face, in the case of the face of Jesus, or the image of a duck or rabbit, that you're kind of reading into this kind of data. So you're bringing something to it. So this would be the modern view of observation in science, that you bring something to the data. There's some way of organizing it. And if there are theories in science, the data is theory-laden. This face stuff, by the way, is interesting. I have another interesting slide here, which I'll show you. It's kind of interesting in terms of faces. This is one here. This is an upside-down face of somebody. Doesn't look too bad upside down. Put it up the right way, and you'll realize the eyes and mouth. That's the wrong way round, actually. Margaret Thatcher, who I left. I just sometimes describe myself as a Thatcherite refugee. When I left Britain, she was in power. Okay. So, you can start to think about this in terms of, these are obviously not scientific images, but you can start to think about this. This are these ordinary ones. You can start to think about it in terms of scientific images, how scientists learn to see through a microscope, famously discussed by Michael Polanyi, ultrasound, read X-rays, and so on. It requires a long training to be able to see these things, famously. So this gets it again at the skill involved in observation. We tend to talk about this in terms of how similarity and difference judgments are made. Despite seeing a face in different lights, we always see it as the same face. You can think of that as an example. But think of other examples. Think of the world of fashion photography. The skill of the person poring over hundreds of pictures of similar faces, say of a glamorous model, is to look for minute differences in faces, to find the one shot that will convey a special idea of beauty in a fashion photograph. So they're trained to look for differences. If what we see out there in the world is an active process and depends in part upon what we bring to it, that seeing is a skill learned in a community of skilled practitioners, then perhaps in science our current concepts and theories about the world may shape what we see. Thus, when 19th century anatomists drew skeletons of men and women, they were influenced by images of women as being like ostriches and men like horses. So women were drawn with long necks and a wide pelvis. Okay, so this is just trying to get at some of the stuff about observation. Now, you may be with me, okay. You may say, okay, science is social in its language. Visual images may be tricky. And sure, people have to learn to see in science. But modern, cutting-edge science, where new knowledge is established, surely it doesn't depend upon looking at images such as the ones we have seen. Well, yes and no. And I want to show you a little bit of a video here. Let me just get to this. I hope it's going to work. Here is a video that comes from Cornell University. What do you see? And you have to look here. This is a canoe in a river. And what you're going to see is something interesting, but it's very quick. Let's hope you can see it. You see something there? A bird. Anybody know what this famous video called the Lateness video is of? This is of, woodpecker, the Ivorybill Woodpecker. Okay, this is a flight of the bird, the Ivorybill Woodpecker. So let me just tell you a little bit about the story. We have a look at this again in a minute. On April the 25th, 2005, the director of the Cornell University Lab for Ornithology, John Fitzpatrick, at the headquarters of the Department of Interior, flanked by 2 cabinet secretaries, announced to the world that the long thought to be extinct Ivory-billed woodpecker was actually alive and well in a swamp in Arkansas. The discovery was such magnitude that it was nearly announced by Laura Bush from the White House. At the last moment they got cold feet, and it wasn't Laura Bush who announced it. The discovery made all the major news media around the world. People reacted dramatically to the news. They have many emails at the Lab of Ornithology from people telling them of the meaning of this discovery to them. One woman who heard the story on NPR had to stop her car on the highway because she burst into tears at the announcement. This bird, as I'm sure you know, is iconic. Not only is it a magnificent bird, but it once was a common inhabitant of the great southern forests that were destroyed after the Civil War. As a special poignancy for North-South relations in the US, because it was northern lumber and industrial interests destroyed the southern forests. As the Ivorybill's habitat shrank, so did numbers of the bird. Ornithologists realized it was shrinking, and one of the saddest parts of the story, the remaining birds were shot in huge numbers as their carcasses became prized for collections. The last known ivorybills were seen during the Second World War. Birders would, however, continue for the 1950s and 1960s to report seeing the bird. In 1966, bird author John Dennis reported seeing an ivorybill in a swamp in East Texas. He swam naked through the water and managed to get a close look. Yet, according to Science magazine, no one believed him. Seeing an ivorybill has become a bit like reporting on seeing a Yeti or the Loch Ness Monster. Fitzpatrick led the 14-month search in great secrecy after initial sightings were made by Tim Gallagher in February 2004. The search, which is harder than looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack given the vast tracts of swamp that need to be covered, led to further sightings, recordings of its distinctive Kent call and its double knocks, and most famously of all, the fuzzy video I've just shown you, which the lab claims and still claims proved the bird's existence. This video, which is enhanced, was shot from a canoe that was continuously being paddled around the bayou in Arkansas near where the bird was first seen. We have conclusive proof that the ivory-billed woodpecker has survived into the 21st century, Fitzpatrick declared. The lab was so confident they had an ivory-bill on film that they kept the discovery secret for many months while they searched. The code name for the bird was Elvis. They persuaded conservation interests to preserve the swamp in Arkansas, possibly the last habitat for ivory-bills. So the science here is tied up with enormous public interest in the bird, not to mention the large sums of money needed to conserve the wetlands. The video is crucial. As David Leno, who shot the video, says, if you have something like a picture or video or sound recording, then others are able to make up their minds based on science rather on their feelings of how much they believe somebody. It's a high-stake game, and after the initial glory of the discovery, Cornell sent huge teams at great expense to conduct further searches. But since then, not a single ivorybill has been seen by the Cornell group. Worse, skeptics, including a leading ornithologist, David Sibley, who wrote the Illustrated Sibley Guide to Birds, have challenged the Cornell observations, claiming that the famous video is in fact that of the common pileated woodpecker, which also is black and white. It all depends on which stage of the flight of the bird the film is interpreted to be. Sibley argues that the white, and maybe we can look at it again, I'll show you the image again. Let me give you Sibley's argument. He argues that the white on the wings is the underside of pileated wings, not the trailing edge of an ivorybill's. Other details of the video, including the size of the bird, what stage of flight it is at, are contested. The skeptics talk about groupthink at the Cornell lab and criticize them for being so secretive. Fitzpatrick counters that he had to be secretive to protect the habitat, and that the skeptics are going to be responsible for the extinction of the bird because by doubting it, they're preventing the Cornell group from raising money for its conservation. So let's just have a quick look at it again. So this is, a real piece of scientific data at the heart of a controversy about what you actually see. And there it is. And because it'd be much better if they had a real ivorybill. But this is the evidence they have. Okay. Tempers are frayed, the stakes were high. So here's a contemporary example of scientists arguing over exactly the sort of visual material we've been talking about. The visual material does not speak for itself, and both sides have to interpret the material. Both sides read into it what they want. There is, as we say in the Sociology of Science, we have a technical term for this, massive interpretive flexibility. The Cornell group believes it has evidence that there were 1 or 2 ivorybills in Arkansas in 2004 and 2005, and still believe this to be the case. The skeptics, who are growing in number as long as Cornell does not come up with new evidence, are convinced the Cornell ornithologists are mistaken. The mistake is again wrapped up in human motivations, such as the need to publicize the lab, the need to keep its name out there, and so on. The truth needs no such human wrapping. It will just out all on its own accord. That's the standard view. So far, I've given you a little taste of language, ordinary observation, and scientific observation. What about the final gold standard for science? Repeatable experimental evidence. And now we move on more to the core of science. Now here too, the sociology of science has been able to make some inroads. The clue is a deep issue first discussed by the British chemist Michael Polanyi. Let me get back to my PowerPoint here. There's Ivorybill on the left, affiliated on the right. Okay. Now, Polanyi was the first to point out that experimental practice in the sciences, he may not have been the first to get attention to any, are full of something he called tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is knowledge which can be passed on, but which cannot be explicated. It is knowledge typically learned on the job when a skilled user shows someone how to do something. Polanyi's most famous example was riding a bike. Everyone learns to ride a bike in the same way. You push your kid along on the bike. One moment the kid cannot ride the bike, the next moment the kid can ride the bike. They've learned something new, some knowledge seems to have been passed on, but it's certainly you don't pass it on by explicating the laws of physics or balance. There may be a few tips or heuristics, like keep your eyes on the front wheel or something like that, but they've learned something. Okay. Polanyi pointed to many areas of the crafts like pottery and woodwork which depend upon tacit knowledge. It's well known in such crafts that the best way to learn is not from a book, but from someone who has the skills already. My favourite example, I use lots of examples in class, is cookery and cooking a cheese souffle. I asked the students to take down a recipe for a cheese souffle and try and cook one at home. Now, very few people in America know what a cheese souffle properly is. But the students get a recipe and they try and follow it and they try and cook one. And usually they fail. Their souffle, instead of rising and being a light, succulent thing to taste, will probably look like a hard brown crust on the floor of their oven. There's a lot of tacit knowledge involved in learning how to cook and making a souffle, including the skill of folding in. You beat up some egg whites, and that skill of folding in the cheese mix into the egg white is a good example of a tacit skill. Now, many routine lab tasks in science involve this tacit knowledge, Polanyi said. Often such knowledge is held by technicians, and grad students in labs often hang out with them to learn such knowledge. Such knowledge, by definition, is not written down. The tacit knowledge issue became even more interesting when my colleague Harry Collins started to study the replication of experiments. He followed groups trying to build the first lasers in North America in the 1970s. One lab could get their laser to work, and working here means vaporizing a block of concrete. This was a transverse excited atmospheric CO2 laser. But other labs couldn't build the laser from reading scientific papers alone. They had to visit the original lab and watch what was being done there. Then they found they could go away and do it. Collins argued that doing such visits, they picked up the crucial tacit knowledge to build lasers. He's extended this argument to experimental replication in general. It nicely solves, by the way, there's some of the examples of where you learn skills. Let me just move on there. They're learned on the job, lengthy apprenticeship, learning by doing. Here's just some more things. You're only aware of these skills when you don't have them. Children trying to do things for the first time. Tying a shoelace is a massively skilled activity. I've tried to show the kid how to do it. I have an example. I sometimes use this in class. We did some filming over at the Cornell Vet School, and me being a sociologist had to put the gown on and the surgical gloves on. There's a special technique to put surgical gloves on to stop them getting your fingers on the surface. And you see me fail at this skilled task. So I use that as an example of another skilled task. Okay. So what does this do, this work on replication by Collins, when he's extended this to experimental replication in general? It nicely solves one of the mysteries of school science. Why do students at school spend all their time repeating the science we know already in experiments rather than try and find out something new? Say, make a new discovery. It's because if they repeat what's known, we have a good measure of whether or not they've acquired the skills. They simply work away at something until they come out with the right results, and we know what the right results should be because they only work on knowledge we already know. So we know how something should come out. If they fail to repeat an experiment with the correct results, we can say they simply lack the skills and must go at it again until they come out with the right answer. Something similar happens at the research frontiers, as the historian of science Thomas Kuhn argues. Scientists work within a framework of theory and practice he calls a paradigm, and they do normal science within this paradigm. The problem sets of the neophyte and even the research scientist program of research produce results which fit within an accepted body of belief. Most of these new experiments are never repeated because they produce knowledge which fits in with the accepted paradigm. If a scientist cannot solve a puzzle within normal science, it's usually the scientist who is at fault rather than the paradigm. So these little skills, to just think of something, you don't have to get to a fancy example, just think of taking your temperature, your own temperature of your body. You know, if you put the thermometer either in your mouth or under your arm or something and come up with a ridiculous reading like your temperature is 150 degrees, then you know you've done something incompetent, you've done it wrong, you haven't had the skill, you haven't made a new discovery about the temperature of your body. Okay. So you learn, how to reject outrageous results. In this view of science, the scientists are trained within and pass on tacit knowledge and skills within an accepted framework. But what if there's a surprise and a result such as cold fusion or the sighting of an ivorybill is claimed, which does not fit with our accepted paradigms? According to Kuhn, such results are often put aside as anomalies, as he calls them. But sometimes, when the scientists concerned are very visible, the anomalous results generates a heated controversy as other scientists weigh in and trying to make the same observation, repeat the experiments and so forth, as it will happen with these neutrinos traveling faster than the speed of light. But except there, the replication, it takes a long time to set up those particular experiments. So then we look at this area where science, where the outcomes are contested. And most of the examples, we have empirical examples from episodes of the history of science and contemporary science in this book, come from this sort of science where the outcome is contested. There are cases where the outcome is uncertain. No one knows in advance whether the ivorybill will be found or whether cold fusion exists or for some current issue, whether neutrinos can travel faster than the speed of light. We don't really know that. In this situation, now here's the trick of this. Think of this situation in terms of the skill model of science. Something interesting is happening. With the laser building example, there's a direct measure of skill. If you can vaporize a block of concrete with your laser, you've got the skill to build the laser. But in the ivorybill case, there is not, because no one knows whether the skilled scientists, the observers like Fitzpatrick and his colleagues who see an ivorybill, or those like Sibley who look at the same video and do not. Exactly the same logic applies to attempts to repeat experiments, and this is what Collins and I call the experimenter's regress. There's a definition of tacit knowledge. Sorry, I should have put this up before. I'm not very competent as a lecturer here, but this is some features of tacit knowledge I've already gone over. Here we get to the experimenter's regress. And this is the logic of these contested outcomes. So, how do you know the correct outcome in the case, say, of cold fusion or ivorybill? To find out, you must do an experiment or make an observation. How do I know if my experiment or observation be carried out competently or a skilled observation? It depends on what the correct outcome is. How do I know what the correct outcome is? To find out, we must do an experiment or make an observation. And it's this kind of circularity that we're pointing to that we call the experimenter's regress. If it is an experimental case, repeating experiments won't necessarily break the regress. Another case we discussed in Golem of this contested outcome is that of something called memory transfer. I don't know if anyone remembers this, associated with a scientist called McConnell. Worms who learnt a behavior and who were ground up and fed to other worms exhibited the same sort of behavior. This phenomenon was called memory transfer and was highly controversial and gave a new meaning to the phrase swallowing the dictionary. But what turns out to be the issue in replication is what counts as the same experiment. No two experiments, trivially, are exactly the same. They're done at different times, for instance, different scientists. Now, we think those things don't matter. Often the replicator will try what he or she thinks, however, though, is a better experiment because there's little credit to be gained in a me-too experiment. I find this all the time when I interview scientists at the research frontiers. They don't want to do the same experiment because there's no credit in that. They want to improve the experiment, do it better. They don't want to do a me-too experiment. However, even if the experiments try and make the experiments as similar as possible, there's always residual differences which can be appealed to account for the different results. What typically happens is that when a negative replication comes in, as they did for cold fusion, the originator of the first experiment, say Pons and Fleischmann, will claim that none of the experiments were carried out in exactly the same way as their experiments, and this accounts for the negative results. The same thing happened when people failed to replicate the memory transfer experiments. By the way, just a little footnote on this. Many of these results were published in a famous, now defunct, I think it's defunct journal, called the Worm Runner's Digest, which was an interesting journal because it had real science in it and joke science at the back, printed upside down. Mixing up of humor and serious science is probably never a good thing. So scientists point, in the case of other experiments, to subtle variables that are not being attended to and might account for the experiments being different. When I teach this in class, here's the way I try and think of it in terms of common sense examples again. I have the example of the TV chef. Go back to cookery. Supposing you see a TV chef do a nice dish on television, which you feel enticed to try out at your next dinner party. You jot down the recipe, buy the ingredients, and try it out. You'll probably do it at home rather than straight away at the dinner party. You probably practice one. What you're in effect doing is repeating an experiment, and as in science, you may not repeat things exactly. You may substitute your own favourite olive oil for the one they use on the TV. You may prefer to use another brand of flour, or whatever. You try it out, again, okay, you tried it out, you think you got it right, but it doesn't come out right. Your exotic mash turns to mush. It looks horrible, tastes horrible, is horrible. Perhaps you missed some crucial ingredient or step. You go online, find the recipe, try again, you fail. As bad as before, horrible. Now you have to make a judgment as to your own skill and competence. Is that new dish any good, or is it you that are no good? You might so this is the sort of thing that research frontiers science involves as well. You have to make a judgment as who are the skilled people in these sort of controversies. Now you might close the regress. These regresses don't last forever because an outcome will emerge, a consensus emerge. You may close the regress by bowing to the superior skills of the TV chef. You can conclude you just weren't up to the job. But darn it, suppose you've been cooking for 20 years and you really are a dab hand in the kitchen. You might say, perhaps they cheat a bit. Perhaps this new dish is really no good. It can't be made that way. And I think this is the sort of dilemma. So I use this sort of example to try and point to that dilemma. In the end, science cannot work without trust and credibility. There's a web of trust and credibility. Scientists just cannot know everything. Like I had to trust my daughter about DNA. They have to trust others, whether it is their colleagues or scientists elsewhere. Often they'll make judgments as to the credibility of the people. Then all sorts of social factors will come into play, such as their demeanour. Theory plays an important role in these sort of controversies. What is theoretically implausible will often be used to help close the regress, and this is how parapsychology and most fringe sciences are dealt with. The point can be made in an even more fundamental way. When claims about the natural world are made, there's always issues of trust and credibility at stake. Nature doesn't speak for him or herself. There's always a scientist speaking on behalf of nature, and we have to decide who's credible and trustworthy. Mostly this process will be invisible, as invisible as your trust in your bank when you deposit your money in your bank. But if that bank is threatened with collapse, trust once more appears as an issue. The same happens with these scientific controversies at the research frontiers. For years, the Cornell lab for ornithology was routinely taken as the most trustworthy source of knowledge in birding. The Ivorybill case is now damaging that trust. So my argument has been, and I'm coming to my conclusion now, that the roots of scientific knowledge in language, and obviously I had to do this very quickly, observation, experiment, are social roots. I hope to have convinced you that the social process of trust and credibility go to the heart of even experimental science. So if you buy this argument, where does this leave us? As we think of the big issues of the day, where science, technology and medicine get increasingly tangled with policy and political issues, can the Golem view of science help? I think it can help by removing one of the extra instabilities which ill-informed discussions of science bring to the table. I'd like to close by going back to the model of science the Golem advocates. And one of the motivations for Collins and I writing this Golem book, our first one, was the enormous instability we perceived in the relationship between scientists and the public. On the one hand were scientists who were prepared to admit in private to each other that science is human, involves skill, and there are uncertainties in it, and it's embedded in society and culture. On the other hand, they often maintained in public the view that science was about certainty. This seems to have been because by acting like high priests, scientists could win the support of society, and that doesn't seem to work any longer. With issues like global warming, the public increasingly see experts on both sides of the debates over science. The public have become increasingly aware of how hard it is for scientists sometimes to reach agreement. Brought up on promises of overweening certainty, the public do not know how to handle uncertainty and disagreement. And that is when the danger of instability and overreaction comes in. Rather than seeing science as a body of expertise which has moments of uncertainty, they turn against science, rejecting it as a political conspiracy, something that does not produce valid knowledge at all, and worse, that earlier forms of knowledge, such as religion, will suffice. This is what we call unstable, flip-flop thinking about science, when the public flips from investing too much certainty and authority in science, the opposite view of rejecting science totally. The argument of the Golem is to attempt to resurrect the middle way, the view which scientists are themselves prepared to concede in private sometimes, that science has a human side to it, that scientists are experts who reach expert conclusions, sometimes in a messy way. For us, expertise is the correct model for thinking about science. Scientific experts are skillful practitioners like other skilled groups in society, like potters, weavers, carpenters, and plumbers. We should respect such groups as experts. A carpenter may not claim absolute certainty, but can still make a beautiful and workable cabinet. As we say in the Golem, because no one thinks of plumbing as being immaculately conceived, we do not have anti-plumbing movements in our society, as far as I know. Well, we have anti-science movements. It's important that what I'm saying here is not in any way meant to support such anti-science movements. I'm not saying that science is the same as plumbing. Rather, that the right model for thinking about science in relation to its publics, in relation to other institutions, like, say, the law, is to think of it as a body of expertise carried out by human practitioners. We live, without question, in a society based upon the institutions of science, technology, and modern medicine. Scientists and engineers should be accorded all the attention and respect they deserve, and which we give other experts in our society. My last line, the golem of science will only be tamed if we realize ultimately that he or she is human in origin. Thank you very much.